In the heart of the Sahel, under a sun that does not forgive weakness, a voice rose, not with anger, but with certainty. Burkina Faso will no longer bow. Africa will no longer bow. These were not words spoken in a grand international chamber, not read from a teleprompter in New York or Geneva. They were spoken in the dust of Ouagadougou by a man the world thought would fall silent. But what if he doesn't? What if this moment is not an outburst, but the beginning of something bigger? This is not about Burkina Faso alone. This is not even just about gold, or foreign bases, or flags. This is about memory, about how a continent remembers who it used to be and who it dares to become again. Reports had emerged of a warning, allegedly sent from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to African leaders. A quiet reminder, it said, Africa should know its limits. But on that day, Ibrahim Traoré didn't answer with a press release. He answered with a declaration that shook the continent. Sovereignty or nothing. That wasn't a headline. It was a gauntlet thrown, a new era drawn in the sand. And in markets across Ouagadougou, in villages of Mali, in the cities of Guinea, his words were repeated like prophecy. Radios crackled, students chanted, elders wept. The world asked, is this madness or is this a second revolution? And now the question comes to you. If you were in Traoré's seat, would you choose freedom or safety? Because the world believes Africa must always choose silence. But what if one man just rewrote that rule? Stay with us. What happens next could change everything you thought you knew about Africa, Ibrahim Traoré, and the fate of nations. Burkina Faso has spoken. But who else will answer? Traoré, declaration of war and popular reaction. The story begins not in the shadows, but under the unforgiving Sahel sun. In a press conference broadcast live from Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré stood behind a simple wooden podium. No suit, no script, just a uniform, a stare that cut through stone, and a single message. Burkina Faso will no longer bow. Africa will no longer bow. It was a response to a rumored warning from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a warning that African leaders should know their limits. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't ask for permission. He issued a declaration. And with those words, history twisted. In the capital, shopkeepers paused their trades. In schools, teachers lowered their voices so students could hear the speech through radios. At the university gates, young people erupted. Makeshift banners scrawled in red ink read, "Sovereignty or nothing. We are not colonies. This time, we stand." And it wasn't just words. Within 48 hours, the Burkina Faso Parliament announced emergency sessions to discuss a groundbreaking proposal, the Sovereignty Act, a draft law that would do what few African governments had ever dared to do publicly. First, it would ban new foreign military bases on Burkina Faso soil. Second, it would renegotiate existing mining contracts, starting with the largest foreign players from France, Canada, and the UK. Third, it would reclaim control over the nation's gold exports, nearly 70% of which had historically benefited companies abroad more than citizens at home. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Radio stations across the country opened their lines. Callers from Dori to Bobo Dioulasso expressed disbelief and pride. "We have waited our whole lives to hear this," said one elderly man. "I thought I would die before we stood again." Civil society groups mobilized overnight. Women's organizations called for free maternal clinics funded by gold revenues. Youth movements launched campaigns to promote local farming and reduce dependency on imported food. In one small town, farmers gathered and held a symbolic bonfire. burning expired foreign pesticide packages and replacing them with seeds labeled Made in Faso. And, on the streets of Ouagadougou, something even more powerful happened. Traoré's face began appearing alongside the image of another young soldier, Thomas Sankara. Red berets, bold stares, same country, same dream. It was as if a thread, long buried beneath coups and corruption, had suddenly been pulled taut. The slogans returned. The chants revived. Down with dependency, up with dignity. The land belongs to us. Traoré walks, Sankara watches. But this was more than nostalgia. The parliament, once known for hesitancy, rushed into action. Debates that usually stretched for weeks were condensed into hours. Articles of the Sovereignty Act were discussed, revised, and approved in principle within 3 days. The law would require that all future mining contracts include a minimum 51% state ownership. All military assistance would be reviewed and subject to parliamentary oversight. Foreign NGOs would be audited to ensure they were not acting as soft power proxies for foreign intelligence. The response from the people was overwhelming. Mothers brought food to soldiers standing guard outside Parliament. Street musicians played freedom songs near Revolution Square. School children drew pictures of gold bars being turned into books and pencils. But even as the mood on the ground surged, tensions elsewhere began to stir. Some Western embassies issued quiet warnings to their citizens. Foreign investors requested urgent meetings with Burkina Faso officials. Canadian mining executives reportedly flew in for last-minute negotiations, only to be told there will be no negotiation with the past, only contracts for the future. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso wasn't begging for deals. It was setting terms. And in that moment, the impossible seemed possible, that a small, landlocked country once dismissed as unstable might just become the flashpoint for a continental revolution. Because if gold could be reclaimed in Faso, why not uranium in Niger? Why not oil in Nigeria? The Sahel was watching, the continent was listening, and the message was loud and clear. Sovereignty is not a slogan, it's policy. But as hope burned bright in the streets, darker forces began to gather. Sahel Alliance rises. The West is silent. What followed Traoré's declaration was not silence. It was thunder. In Bamako, the capital of Mali, state television interrupted its regular broadcast to replay the speech. Colonel Assimi Goïta, Mali's transitional leader, issued a short message of solidarity. The Sahel stands united. In Conakry, Guinea's President Mamadi Doumbouya, himself a military man, no stranger to confrontation, declared, Africa must no longer negotiate with its knees bent. Within days, what began as a speech in Ouagadougou became a continental echo. In marketplaces, hashtags surged. On university walls in Dakar, the words Africa will not bow were graffitied in red. Pan-African bloggers posted translations of the speech in Swahili, Arabic, and even Lingala, from Lagos to Lusaka, from Nairobi to Nouakchott. Young Africans whispered the same question. What if this time it's real? And then came the moment no one expected. Behind closed doors, a secret meeting took place, far from cameras, far from microphones. Top military officials from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger gathered in a remote Sahel location. 3 nations, 3 juntas, 1 purpose. The result was a historic announcement, the West African Sovereignty Pact. Not a document of sentiment, but of structure. A mutual defense clause. An attack on one would be an attack on all. A joint investment bank, named the Confederate Bank for Investment and Development (CBID), to end reliance on Western donors. A plan for shared infrastructure beginning with a regional electricity grid and biometric passport system. And for the first time in modern African history, a sub-regional alliance wasn't being coordinated in Brussels or New York. It was forged in Africa, by Africans, for Africans. The people responded like lightning. In Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, a massive banner unfurled, Souveraineté ou rien. In Bamako, schoolchildren recited Traoré's speech as part of their civic education. In Niamey, Niger, soldiers painted murals of the three leaders standing shoulder to shoulder with the caption, "One land, one voice, one stand." But while Africa erupted in pride, the West responded with silence. And that silence was deafening. From Washington, no comment. From Paris, only muted concern. From Tel Aviv, no denial, no confirmation. Nothing. For seasoned analysts, the quiet said more than words, because silence, in geopolitics, is not inaction, it is calculation. In think tanks across the West, emergency briefings were held. The Pentagon warned that the Mutual Defense Clause could complicate counterterrorism operations, where U.S.-word drones and special forces had long enjoyed unmonitored access. The State Department debated whether to apply sanctions, offer backdoor negotiations, or wait for internal collapse. In Europe, the reaction was more emotional. French newspapers mourned the final nail in the coffin of France-Afrique, the informal empire of influence France had long held in its former colonies. One editorial in Le Monde read, "First they expelled our troops. Now they expel our system." In Canada, mining firms issued shareholder alerts. In London, analysts quietly predicted a surge in Chinese and Russian influence across West Africa. But what worried Western officials most wasn't Russia or China. It was the idea itself. That sovereignty was spreading like a wildfire, that ordinary Africans were starting to believe, and belief is the one thing you cannot bomb, bribe, or blockade. Within a month of Traoré's speech, the Sovereignty Act was moving toward full parliamentary vote. And the Sovereignty Pact, it was already producing real policy. SEBID, the Joint Investment Bank, launched a pilot for rural electrification using pooled gold revenues. Plans for a common biometric passport were underway, easing movement across the Sahel. This wasn't just talk. This was infrastructure. This was governance. But not everyone celebrated. Inside Burkina Faso, rumors swirled. Intelligence officers spoke of foreign agents probing for weaknesses. Opposition figures claimed surveillance had increased. Journalists whispered of detentions and anonymous threats. International rights groups raised alarms. Is the revolution becoming authoritarian? And yet, across the streets of Ouagadougou, no one seemed confused. "We have known dictatorship. We have known war. We have known famine," said one woman at a rally. "But we have never known dignity, and now we have tasted it." In the clash between rights and sovereignty, between idealism and realism, the people had chosen their side. And in choosing, they sent a message, not just to their leaders, but to the world. Africa will no longer wait to be saved. It will save itself. But behind closed doors, far from the chants and banners, powerful forces were still watching and plotting. Politics, economy. What began as fire in the words of a young soldier was now forging reality in steel and stone. Across Burkina Faso, the effects of the Sovereignty Act and the West African Pact were no longer confined to headlines. They had begun to seep into everyday life, in the farms, the schools, the dusty corners of forgotten villages, in the rural north, where insecurity had emptied whole communities. Government trucks arrived with solar panels. They weren't gifts. They were investments funded directly from gold revenues that, until recently, vanished into foreign banks. In Ouagadougou, a quiet revolution unfolded inside the Ministry of Finance. New contracts were drawn with strict clauses. No foreign mining deal could move forward unless it guaranteed at least 51% local ownership. A national audit of all active mining permits began, revealing decades of lost revenue, misreporting, and outright theft. Economists on national television explained in plain language, if we retain just 20% more of our gold income, we can fund universal primary education within 5 years. For teachers long unpaid or teaching without chalk, that message was no longer fantasy, it was policy. And across the capital, hope took on practical form. Vendors sold T-shirts printed with the words, "My gold, my school." Posters in clinics showed Traoré holding a newborn beside the slogan, "Our minerals, our medicine," and in every neighborhood, local farming boomed. As sanctions from the European Union began to bite and imports shrank, communities turned inward. Farmers' cooperatives emerged. Youth dug irrigation canals by hand. Posters read, "Consume local, build Africa." What outsiders called hardship, locals called sacrifice with meaning. But sovereignty had a price, and that price came quickly. France froze development aid. The European Union suspended budgetary support. International NGOs scaled back operations, citing uncertain conditions, yet the streets did not revolt. They reorganized. Informal markets grew. Barter returned. And community radios blasted daily messages of resilience. They took our aid, but they can't take our pride. Politically, a reshuffling began. Opposition parties that had relied on international funding found themselves adrift. Their slogans rang hollow next to the populist fire burning in the streets. Meanwhile, Traoré's image, paired with Thomas Sankare's, grew everywhere, in markets, in mosques, in schools. The struggle continues. Yet not all was celebration. Reports surfaced of arrests, journalists questioned, activists detained. A media watchdog claimed freedom of speech was narrowing. Traoré's government responded, "Sovereignty without discipline is chaos." And for many citizens, especially those in rural areas, order was more precious than unlimited speech. They had known decades of chaos, coups, and terror. Now, for the first time, there were schools with books, clinics with medicine, soldiers without foreign commanders. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Meanwhile, across Mali and Niger, the Sovereignty Pact began to bear fruit. A regional electricity grid was mapped. CBAD, the Joint Investment Bank, announced rural credit programs and microloans for female farmers. Construction started on a Sahel highway, a direct trade route bypassing ports dominated by coastal nations. For the first time, landlocked no longer meant powerless. But with progress came pressure. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, condemned the Sovereignty Pact as a destabilizing bloc. Sanctions were discussed, travel bans issued. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger responded by formally withdrawing from ECOWAS. It was a dangerous move, one that could isolate them regionally. But isolation, they argued, was already here. What they sought now was alignment with dignity. Outside Africa, the ripples spread. African diasporas in France, the U.S., and Brazil organized rallies in support. Speakers invoked Sankara, Lumumba, and now Traoré. He gave us back our mirror, one elder said. For the first time in a long time, we saw ourselves standing upright. But not everyone agreed. Some warned that the movement was being used to suppress dissent under the banner of nationalism. Others feared that if Burkina Faso failed, it would not just be a political defeat, but a death blow to African self-belief. And so, the weight grew. Every electrified school, every redistributed gold bar, every farmer paid fairly became not just policy wins, but battlegrounds of narrative. The revolution wasn't just on the ground, it was in the mind. And while the world debated, the people of Burkina Faso marched forward, not into certainty, but into ownership of their future. The slogan changed from "Africa will not bow" to "Africa is building." The winds of Ouagadougou have never blown this hard. For decades, Africa was told, be patient, be grateful, be silent. But Ibrahim Traoré did not whisper. He roared, and his voice awoke more than a country. It cracked open a century. Today, schools once crumbling are filling with students. Villages once forgotten are lit by electricity drawn from gold once stolen, and soldiers once commanded by outsiders now patrol under a single word: sovereignty. The West African Sovereignty Pact has survived its infancy. The Confederate Bank for Investment and Development is issuing real loans. And youth movements from Senegal to South Africa now chant not in protest, but in policy. But this road is not without shadows. Sanctions loom. Alliances shift. Sabotage whispers through the Sahel wind like a warning. Great powers do not watch revolutions with kindness. They prepare answers. And history is not merciful to the bold. Sankara, Lumumbas, Nkrumah, each dared, each paid. So now, a question falls upon this generation like a sacred weight. Will Africa finish what its heroes began? Or will this too be another dream betrayed? In every corner of the continent, the youth are watching. In the diaspora, elders are praying. But no one knows what comes next. Will the Sahel rise as the new cradle of African independence, or will it be punished until its hope is strangled? Will Burkina Faso stand or be made an example? And you, sitting there, hearing these words, what do you believe? Because revolutions are not carried by leaders alone. They are carried by voices, and voices become movements, and movements become nations. So, we ask you, before this chapter is written by someone else, is sovereignty worth the sacrifice? Can dignity survive without approval from the powerful? Will Africa ever truly own its gold, its land, its story? This is not the end. This is the beginning of a question too big for one man, too dangerous for silence, too sacred to forget. If it lives in your chest, let it rise from your tongue. Speak it, share it. Let the world hear what Africa has buried too long. Comment your vision below. New Africa. Africa rises. Africa decides. Because if the story of this century is ever told, let it say that we chose to walk upright. For Ibrahim Traoré, for Burkina Faso, for Africa. This is only the beginning.